Hello and welcome to the second installment of the Iran Colloquium series for this year. I know that you are all now joining in to the webinar. This is a webinar format. So as you start to join in, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Travis Zada, and I'm the director of the Yale program in Iranian Studies. Our guest speaker today is Professor Aria Fani from the University of Washington. We are also joined as well by Professor Samuel Hodgkin from Yale's Department of Comparative Literature, who will introduce today's talk and will moderate your questions as they come in. And so without further ado, I will now turn the conversation over to Sam. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Travis. So yes, in a moment, I'll say a bit more about our speaker, but before I begin, I should thank Marjan Wardaki, our postdoctoral associate who organized this lecture. And I should also thank the Yale Macmillan Center, and in particular, our Center for Middle Eastern Studies, whose wonderful staff helped with the logistics for this event. And just so you know, the excellence of today's speaker is in line with the quality of this series as a whole. We have great talks coming up from Parisa Vaziri a week from today, and Mejgan Masumi on December 1st. So stay tuned. But let me tell you a bit about our speaker, whose scholarship really charts out a path for where the study of Persian literature is headed. Aria Fani is the director of the Persian and Iranian Studies program at the University of Washington, an assistant professor in their Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, occupying the Elahe Omidyar Mir Jalali Professorship in Persian and Iranian Studies, and the organizer of the Pacific Northwest Adab Society. He's currently completing a book entitled Spaces Between Nations, Afghans, Iranians, and the Making of Persian Literature, which looks certain to be a major intervention given the ways that he has already begun to change our field. Fani received his PhD in Near Eastern Studies from the University of California at Berkeley in 2019, by which time he had already authored an impressive range of articles on the poetry of the Soviet-Afghan War, the modern poet Bijan Jalali, and literary translation, as well as brilliant public scholarship on the Ajam Media Collective website and elsewhere, and a Persian language textbook for heritage learners. Since then, working not only in Persian and Arabic, but increasingly in Pashto as well, he has become a driving force for the reorientation of Persian literary studies into a transnational, trans-regional enterprise through his publications on the entangled histories of Iranian and Afghan literary canon formation in the 20th century, his incisive interventions in translation studies and world literature studies, and his editorial role at the Journal of Iranian Studies. He is the co-organizer of a forthcoming cluster in that journal entitled Persian Past's National Presence, Persian Literary and Cultural Production in the 20th Century, and an organizer of a working group in trans-regional late Persianate and post-Persianate studies, in both of which enterprises I feel fortunate to have been able to participate. But I feel even more lucky to call him my friend. At this point, we've been in a conversation for more than 8 years, and I cannot imagine a more thoughtful interlocutor or a more humane Rafiq. His scholarship and teaching are integrally linked to his advocacy work with asylum seekers from Central America, and especially in this crucial moment of collective responsibility for all of us as Americans from Afghanistan as well. He is truly a model of the combination of ethical responsibility and aesthetic refinement that we call adab. And his talk today is entitled, What Does Translation Mean in the Age of Colonial Modernity? Finally, just a word about format. During and after today's lecture, please send your questions to me using the Q&A function on Zoom, and afterwards we'll get through as many as we can. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Aria. Welcome.
Sam, it's never a good idea to render your speaker speechless right about when they're about to give a talk. You made me teary-eyed. Thank you so much for that heartfelt and sincere introduction. I'm very grateful to have you as a colleague and friend. I'm also very thankful to Dr. Marjan Wardaki also for her friendship and for this invitation. And my thanks go to the Yale program in Iranian Studies. I will go ahead and share my slides with you and then speak into the vacuum, but I know you see me and you hear me. It is by now uncontroversial to state that translation played a central role in the making of modernity in all of its ideological, socio-political, and formal iterations in Persian-speaking societies. But we still know very little about the meaning of translation and how that meaning is changed in the period between the 19th and the early 20th centuries. What valences did the term tarjuma accrue and jettison? What is the cost of accepting translation, the English term translation, as a self-evident and singular equivalent for tarjuma? We need to be more careful in defining and understanding tarjuma, not in its bounded modern definition, but as a concept and practice that was embedded in a larger discourse of ideas, one that became reified at a particular moment in time. Now, one way to access tarjuma's obscured genealogy is by revisiting Persian language periodicals that proliferated in late 19th and early 20th century Iran, Afghanistan, and their diasporas. Such analysis would shed a critical light on both tarjuma and periodicals. The former would emerge as a historically grounded, culture-specific, and context-dependent concept, while the latter would no longer be seen as static texts to be mined for data, and instead would be framed as a major site for cultural conversations that yielded lasting outcomes. The rise of literature as a notion in the 19th century, or allow me to take a step back. The main contention here I have is that the concept of tarjuma is inseparable from an interlinked network of concepts such as nation, history, civilization, language, literature, homeland, and others that underwent consequential conceptual realignments in the 19th and 20th centuries. That is, in the wake of colonial modernity. For instance, the term tarikh came to signify history, marked by a positivist methodology that produced mythologized narratives about unitary peoples, Turk, Arab, Afghan, Iranian, framed as racialized heirs to distinctive civilizations. The idea of civilization, which once denoted civility in contradistinction to barbarity, began in the 1930s to invoke a global assemblage of civilizations, each in possession, each characterized by its own history and literature. Similarly, the term adabiyat became a singular appellation for literature and a proprietary byword for civilizational achievement and cultural singularity. These conceptual realignments were byproducts of epistemological changes brought about by colonial modernity. The rise of literature as a notion in the 19th century was itself entangled with the formation of philology and its epistemic assumptions about textuality in relation to ethnic and linguistic difference. The idea of tarjuma was shaped and takes shape within this node of concepts. Examining tarjuma without showing how it is formed in connection with this conceptual network renders it a standalone and timeless discourse. And doing so obscures how translation participated in the making of ontological nationalism, a discourse built on the hierarchicized model of intrinsically constituted ethnic and linguistic difference that formed the basis of nation states' claims to cultural and political cohesion. Now, I have to bring the receipts. the task of reifying adabiyat as a defining element of a distinctive civilization would have been unimaginable without translation. For instance, in 1918, the journal Danishkade, published in Tehran, featured a series of essays written by Abbas Iqbal Ashtiani titled Tarikh Adabi, or Literary History. Iqbal's column was one of the earliest positivist accounts of Persian literary history in Iran. In his inaugural essay, Iqbal offered two different meanings of adabiyat. First, he referenced the way it was used by the classics or predecessors, bi-istilah qudama, as a form of ethical conduct gained through knowledge of prose and poetry. And second, the way it was invoked by Europeans, bi-istilah rupayan, which, in addition to the knowledge of prose and poetry, included the possession of what he called a critical spirit, ruh-e intiqadi. Next to this key phrase, Iqbal wrote in parentheses the French term revue in the Latin script. He offered no explanation for this usage and its translation, right? Iqbal, like many of his cohorts, recognized that periodicals constituted an emerging site within which a new discourse of literature was taking form, including European terms within Persian language texts became common in this period. In 1913, Mir Ghulam Muhammad Ghubar, an eminent historian of Afghanistan, wrote an essay in the first issue of the journal Kabul titled Afghanistan, Adabiyat dar Afghanistan, or Literature in Afghanistan, in which he used the term literature in the Latin alphabet next to the phrase ilm adabi. Both Iqbal and Ghubar strategically deployed translation as a way of reconfiguring the context and meaning of adabiyat, which in its pre-modern iteration designated sciences, and I invoke science as just a systematized knowledge here, that pertain to adab as proper form and ethical conduct. Simply put, the authors here ask readers to read a familiar word, adabiyat, and understand it in a new way through French literary culture, that of 19th century. It is important to note that revue would not be translated as critical spirit today, while the phrase ilm adabi would be translated more precisely as literary science and not literature. But these mistranslations, if we can call them that, are particularly illuminating in that they illustrate the generative force of conceptual alignment and the unsettled nature of adabiyat as a concept whose meaning became automatized and culturally cemented only in the latter part of the 20th century. Another example, Danishkade featured two serialized essays that appeared under the titles Inqilab Adabi, Literary Revolution, and Tarikh Adabi, Literary History, written respectively by Rashid Yasami and Abbas Iqbal Ashtiani. Yasami's column provided readers with an account of French literary history, presumably adapted and translated from French language textbooks used for secondary education. Yasami's column on French literature complemented and facilitated the reception of Iqbal Ashtiani's series by making visible the need for a narrative of Persian literary history invented in the mold of Western European nationalist literary historiography. Now, at that time, no Persian literary history in its positivist and national sense existed in Persian. As mentioned earlier, translation helped to create cultural parallelisms that provided literary intellectuals with a roadmap to bring concepts such as adabiyat into closer alignments with late 19th century Western European understandings of literature as a body of text that embodies the essence of a nation. In this case, the parallelism created by Yasami was powerfully clear. Any nation that aspires to be considered civilized must have a literary history that chronicles how its literature was enshrined by its people against other nations. Through that process, translation became burdened with anxieties of influence and originality, informed by the monological ethos of romantic nationalism. Iqbal Ashtiani's Tarikh Adabi demonstrates this point. He framed the establishment of Arabic as the main language of scientific production and cultural importance between the 7th and 10th centuries in Iran as a period of subjugation. For Iqbal, the fall of the Sasanians to Arab Muslims marked the subjugation of a civilized nation, Millat Mutamaddin, to a primitive tribe, Qawm Badawi, who set out to erase their cultural heritage. And he argued that Iranians were silent for 2 centuries because they could not write in their own script, Khat Khud, or speak in the Iranian language, Zaban Irani. Even though he had designated this period as one of literary decline, Iqbal Ashtiani still recounted the fact that Middle Persian literary lore and knowledge was translated into Arabic, deeply enriching that literary tradition. The ethos of cultural singularity, ascendant in this period, that is the 1910s and 20s, is hardly subtle in Iqbal's assertion. It is only in Persian that Iranians can convey their thoughts. In essence, when literature is posited as an expression of an ethno-nationalist essence, translation is conceived as a vessel for an unmediated transmission of knowledge, a nugget passed down from one distinctive civilization to another. What do these examples demonstrate about the shifting meaning of translation in this period? Tarjuma came to exclusively mean translation from one language into another, in a world where language had been transformed into an integral element of national and ethnic identity. In this world, being mattered more than becoming. Roots outweighed routes. Before and after the advent of colonial modernity, people had acquired Persian as a language of learning. The aesthetic norms and the sensibilities that they had cultivated over many centuries were not considered native to a singular culture or territory. Ontological nationalism disturbed this world and created one of native homelands, mother tongues, and cultural singularity. It is then unsurprising that in this modern context, that mediation that lies at the heart of translation was conceived in terms of loss. The framing of translation as loss or betrayal can be in part attributed to the fact that in the wake of colonial modernity, languages have assumed a symbolic function, framed as an index of a unitary people's historical identity and eroticized as an element of national individuality. In that vein, loss as a romantic concept itself begins to serve as a symbolic function, performing untranslatability for sites of power, be they sacred or secular. Another outcome of this period is a heightened awareness towards translation as a mechanism of cultural exchange and knowledge production. For example, in an article titled Ahamiyat Tarjuma, the importance of translation in Kabul, Ahmad Ali Khan Durrani attributed the progress of Europe, which he called the source of knowledge and the center of innovation, to careful study and translation of our ancestors' ideas, Afkar Mutaqaddimine Ma, a reference primarily to Greco-Arabic knowledge. Durrani then commented on the names of 19th century European translators who had translated Near Eastern texts into various European languages. Each name was footnoted in the Latin alphabet for reference. He praised 19th century figures like Anquetil du Perron and Goethe for their engagement with Eastern knowledge. Ahmad Ali Khan called on Persian language translators to undertake the translation of Ulum Jadida, or modern sciences. He asserted that such an undertaking would help import a needed scientific lexicon lacking in Persian, and pointed to efforts in addressing this lexical impoverishment in Arabic, Urdu, and Iranian Persian as sources of inspiration. Ahmad Ali Khan's article had a clear message for his readers. Borrowing the scientific progress of Europe through translation should not cause feelings of inferiority because Europeans had acquired this knowledge from the East in the first place. So again, translation serving here as unmediated, and it's a nugget of information being passed down in a direct manner. It is important to note that Ahmad Ali Khan wrote this article in his capacity as vice president of the Kabul Literary Association, Anjuman Adabiye Kabul, a society tasked by Muhammad Nadir Shah with producing and promoting a national history for Afghanistan. Anjumans or associations had proliferated in both Iran and Afghanistan in the early 20th century and had become important sites for cultural production. One of the main tasks of these associations was to translate materials that dovetailed well with their literary and national agendas. Now, in fact, many of the members of the Kabul Literary Association had previously worked in Shah Amanullah's translation bureau. This framing of translation as an unmediated form of knowledge transmission was arguably caused by the rise of ontological nationalism that sided with fixed intrinsic identities rather than historically contingent and constituted ones. In an era where language academies and literary associations were founded to affix language to a national imaginary, rid them of words flagged as foreign, and place them within a discourse of literary history often marked by an obsession with monolingualism and pure origins, it is unsurprising that there formed a heightened awareness toward translation. It is in this historical process that tarjuma became reified as translation, signifying a pure contact between two ontological entities. Viewing translation in this light runs the risk of framing mediation altogether as corrupting and its varied outcomes as derivative. There are other ways of understanding the term, however. Tarjuma can also be seen as an interlingual form of rewriting, not unlike parody, biographization, or anthologization. Taskare, commentary, or sharh, or allusion, talmi, among many others. These are ultimately forms of meaning making, part and parcel of a never-ending process of naming, understanding, and managing difference. So in the next section, I will delve into the displaced valences of the term tarjuma. The reification of adabiyat as a conceptual category in the early 20th century would have been unimaginable without translation. In other words, the making of adabiyat as a self-referential, freestanding notion, as opposed to its 19th century and early 20th century status as a marginal and context-dependent concept, took place in a space where tarjuma came to primarily signify translation from one distinctive literary tradition into another. Like adabiyat, the semantic and discursive range of tarjuma was significantly narrowed in the latter part of the 20th century. In that process, tarjuma began to jettison its meaning as biography and interpretation at a moment when literary history was being constructed as a new genre on the grounds of its discursive ruptures from taskare or biographical compendia. I'm thinking of the work of Alexander Jabbari on this. The nation state became the protagonist of historiography, radically changing the context and sites within which biographies were produced and read. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the term tarjuma and its plural tarajem was still used to refer to biographies of notable figures. In the 1860s and the 1870s, the newspaper Ruzname Millati featured biographies of Persian language poets and used tarjuma on two occasions. In 1926, the magazine Sharq featured a biography or tarjuma ahval of Manuchehri Damghani. Here, the term could mean turning life experiences into a narrative. The term was even used in the context of an autobiography, as when Mirza Sadiq Khan Adibul Mamalik wrote an account of his life and lineage under the title Tarjuma in the magazine Armaqan. Biographies were key features of pre-modern literary cultures and spilled over into multiple historiographical genres, such as the aforementioned taskare. Biographical writing did not stop with the advent of romantic nationalism in the 20th century. It only spread from one ecosystem, taskare, into another, periodicals. Early 20th century readers regularly came across biographical accounts of literary figures like Rousseau, Lamartine, Hugo, and Zola, next to biographies of Persian poets and writers. This is the space within which the idea of a nationally differentiated literature took form in Iran and Afghanistan. The many meanings of tarjuma have been registered in Ali Akbar de Khoda's Lughatname, published in the 1930s and 40s. Its entry on tarjuma included the following meanings: communicating words or speech from one language into another, biography or an account of one's accomplishments. The words he uses are sargozasht, tarikh hayat kasi, and karname, naming, namgozari, riddle or enigma, rams mu'amma, interpretation, tafsir, and according to rhetoricians, versifying the meaning of an Arabic line of poetry into Persian. It is worth noting here that medieval rhetoricians such as Shams Qais Razi and Ar-Raduyani used the term bargardandan to convey our modern sense of translation, while tarjuma was often used for a very specific usage glossed by De Khoda, whereby the meanings of Arabic verses were loosely versified in Persian. And here I'd like to thank my colleague Michel Quay for bringing us, teaching me this point. For each meaning, De Khoda cited different sources that included treatises, dictionaries, and histories. De Khoda's Lughatname can serve as a point of entry into the multifaceted history of tarjuma's entanglements with other concepts. But one inference can be clearly made here, and that is that the meaning of tarjuma was more capacious and less settled prior to the rise of ontological nationalism. The close association of the term tarjuma with interpretation or tafsir has a long genealogy in the Near East. Thanks to the work of William Halo, we know that tarjuma is derived from the Old Assyrian turjuman, which took on different variants such as tarjuman in Persian and Arabic and terjuman in Turkish. Among others, Hannah Kronfeld has commented on the fact that turjuman assumed the meaning of a mediator or translator in Jewish textual culture, describing an individual who provided instantaneous translations and commentary, the two would have been indistinguishable, of the rabbi's Hebrew sermons into local Jewish languages such as Aramaic and Greek. The turjuman's act of translation necessarily included commentary in the form of adding parables and examples to make more accessible the rabbi's sermons for a congregation that did not understand Hebrew or that register of it. By contrast, interpretation and commentary are not in the semantic range of the English term translation. That may be one of the reasons why scholars such as Lawrence Venuti have had to remind us time and again that translation is an act of interpretation in order to advocate for the visibility of the translator, whereas in Near Eastern literary traditions, tarjuma cannot be decoupled from interpretation and commentary. Tarjuma's more expansive range of meanings may have been displaced by colonial modernity, but its semantic multiplicity still lingers in ways that have yet to be fully analyzed. For instance, De Khoda's Lughatname affords tarjuman a separate entity in which it is defined as, quote, a person who expresses a word or term in another language, and, quote, a person who is in possession of two languages and makes comprehension possible between speakers of those languages. Citing a variety of sources such as Farhang Anjuman Ara, Farhang Anandraj, and Lexical Syracum, De Khoda then provides multiple variants of the term, including in Syriac, Akkadian, Aramaic, and he even argues that tarjuma comes from the Arabized form of Persian tarzaban. De Khoda then cites a number of Persian poems in which the term tarjuman has been used. In this line by Ferdowsi, the term meant translator. Yaki tarjuman ra zelashkar bejost ki guftar turkan bedanad durost. He searched for a translator in the army, one with a command of the language of Turks. Or in this line by Nasir Khosrow, it means both commentator or sharih and one who reveals. Ali ra tarjuman wahy pindar, ham an ma'ni, ham in ma'ni darudan. Consider Ali the commentator or revealer of the revelation and locate both meanings of the term in him. Other meanings of tarjuman invoked by the poems included fasih or eloquent, and wasit and mediator. These poems cited by De Khuda and the examples analyzed in this chapter collectively show that tarjuma and tarjuman was part of a larger discourse of ideas about the role of language, mediation, and interpretation in the transmission of knowledge in each historical period. As such, tarjuma should not be treated as a trans-historical, a freestanding idea whose meaning is substitutable across different languages, cultural geographies, and time periods. There needs to be more extensive research on the translation cultures of different historical and literary geographies. Now, this chapter, this talk designated colonial modernity as a historical and epistemic designation for certain discursive ruptures that I examined in a very illustrative, non-exhaustive way. One such rupture was caused by the discourses of nationalism that transformed pre-modern conceptual paradigms in relation to linguistic and ethnic difference. It is important to note that colonial modernity should be seen neither as a singular discourse nor the sole epistemic thrust behind the inauguration of modern conceptual transformations in Persian-speaking societies. Encounters with colonial forms of knowledge were no doubt as contextually and discursively varied as they were politically fraught. The task of historicizing translation in the post-colonial context is crucial to expanding our normative paradigm examples beyond certain Western European traditions. Doing so would also help us lay bare anxieties and obsessions and misconceptions that have become pervasive in our world today. I will briefly comment on two such concepts before wrapping up the talk: the idea of the original and the notion of untranslatability. These ideas are not only harmful, but also risk delegitimizing translation as a challenging yet essential enterprise in a world that continues to battle forms of bellicose nationalism, militarism, and climate and economic barbarism. Current scholarship has shown how the idea of the original is itself a construct, created and shored up by certain translation practices and scholarly paradigms. In examining such texts as the Epic of Gilgamesh, Karen Emmerich shows how the original is not stable and is shaped by its translations just as it has shaped them. She questions the assumption that the original exists in a timeless, fixed, and unmediated form and is only altered or corrupted by translation. Under the ethos of ontological nationalism, translation has assumed the task of resolving linguistic and cultural difference, and its failure is set up from the outset. But this trend is reversing thanks to new works of scholarship. Instead, translation today is increasingly viewed as a mode of textual proliferation, another form of mediation or interpretive iteration that adds meaning to the text. In that vein, translation is not seen as a singular attempt to resolve or overcome linguistic and cultural difference, but rather as one solution in a dialogical and necessarily never-ending process of meaning-making. Untranslatability is another byproduct of colonial modernity and its fixation with essence. Elsewhere, I have unpacked how this idea operates and how it restricts the types of questions we must ask. But here I'll reflect on a specific aspect of it. Untranslatability as a conceptual framework was proposed as a corrective to Anglophone appropriations of minoritized literary tradition. And here I'm thinking of Dr. Emily Apter's work. In that vein, it serves as a gesture of cultural recognition and cautions against the total accessibility assumed by an Anglophone global literary market. But untranslatability has proven profoundly inadequate to the task of meaningfully and rigorously accounting for aesthetic and cultural difference. It falsely assumes that meaning is fixed and that the source text exists in an unmediated form to those that read it in the original language. That is what Venuti calls a source text invariant. And as Brian Baer has recently showed, untranslatability falsely poses as incommensurability and reduces translation to a selection of culturally embedded terms and frames everything else as unproblematically transposable. In an effort to produce a conceptual genealogy for untranslatability, Apter references via Abdel Fattah Kilito's "Thou shalt not speak my language," the Quran, which was deemed untranslatable due to its ijaz or inimitability. But two key points are conveniently left out here. First, the discursive purchase of untranslatability, as Kamran Rastegar has showed, remain highly restricted to certain texts in the pre-modern period. Second, translations of the Quran absolutely flourished through the genre of tafsir or exegesis, as Travis Zadeh has shown. We again encounter the inseparability of tarjuma and interpretation and commentary in the pre-modern Judeo-Islamic tradition. Now, ultimately, any scholar who insists on the utility of untranslatability will have to address a simple question. What does the notion of untranslatability convey that the notion of a challenging translation fails to convey? At its core, the concept of untranslatability boils down to a totalizing impulse that operates by policing interpretation in order to prevent the creation of meanings that certain discourses of power view as threatening. For instance, Vincent Raphael has analyzed how the discourse of Spanish colonialism in the Philippines deployed untranslatability to flag vernacular Tagalog interpretations of Catholic sacred texts as perverse deviations from Holy Scripture. In Iran and Afghanistan, untranslatability began to gain currency only in the second half of the 20th century as a feature of ontological nationalism. Casting translation in negative and dismissive metaphors, such as traduttore traditore, or the tired formula of lost in translation, are features of a translation culture that has yet to fully release its imagination from the powerful colonial and national imaginaries. Now, in sum, the field of translation studies has begun to move past the generic and celebratory recognition that translation played a fundamental role in the inauguration and proliferation of modernity. One way to further this aim is to analyze translation in light of its historical contingencies and cultural specificities. Here, I argued that tarjuma in the 20th century should be placed within a node of intersecting and co-constitutive ideas such as history, language, literature, and civilization. Doing so would allow us to historicize translation within the context of Iranian and Afghan cultural histories and approach it in a far more holistic fashion that does not relegate translation as a standalone discourse. Thank you so much for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Aria, for this extraordinarily enlightening talk. And I'm sure the questions are going to be streaming in, but while we're waiting for more to come, I guess I'll take my introducer's privilege of a question to start off with. I mean, something that's always striking in terms of the difference between Persianate studies when dealing with early modern and modern South Asia versus Iran is in dealing with sort of translation, literary contact zones, and specifically the issue of translation, how much emphasis there is on synchronicity in the South Asian case, right? On the sense that European world literature, European Orientalism was generated in this same moment, in the same process that also generated South Asian responses. And then the diffusionism, by contrast, in the Iranian case, right? That we're dealing with these Iranian intellectuals taking up models, or absorbing and engaging with models that come out of Western tradition. So I guess I wonder, do you see synchronicity in the Iranian and Afghan cases that you're dealing with, ways in which the national Iranian and Afghan conceptions of translation are co-produced with European counterparts, or no?
That's such a great question, and it goes to the core of your methodology. And I'm glad that you raised it, because I truly shiver at this grand category of colonial modernity that I have given to my title, because it falsely suggests that this was a single encounter, that it produced an even field, and in reality, we know that is not at all the case. And you brought up South Asia compared to Iran and Afghanistan, and so no, I would say that I don't think I do see that case. I think that there's a multitude of views and perspectives. In fact, when I began to write this paper, I thought to myself that the period that I'm studying would yield a lot of evidence as far as these obsessions and anxieties that I try to examine for you. Originality, loyalty to text, untranslatability would have been visible in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But in reality, there is basically there's a foundation laid for those obsessions to then rear their ugly heads in the latter part of the 20th century. So I think there's a lot of messiness involved. There's no way to neatly graph onto this single category of colonial modernity came and all of these cultures just evenly changed. And maybe if I'm right, I am just reflecting the impoverishment, the methodological impoverishment of the field, right? In general, that it's basically has to recognize that something fundamentally changes with colonial modernity, but hasn't fully, in your own words, like come up with a methodology incisive enough to surgically parse out exactly where these moments happen and in what way. But I just really wanted to at least be provocative in some of the differences that I highlight. But I don't see a uniformity at all.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So I'm going to put up into visibility our colleague Alexander Jabari's question. So are you, so let me, let's see. So thank you for this fascinating talk. You spoke about the changing ways translation tarjuma as a concept was understood and defined. Did decoupling biography from translation and tarjuma have consequences for the way in which translation was actually practiced? Can you tell us about the actual translation projects and how these changes may have impacted them?
That's a fabulous question. The short answer is I don't know. That is definitely an inquiry that needs to be conducted. But Alex knows better himself that the invention of national history is definitely one of the consequences of this decoupling, and the rhetorical structure that is set up, which I have learned so much from his own work on this, in order to articulate rupture from the Tazkere tradition and hide basically all the continuities that it has with that very, and again, I shouldn't speak of the Tazkere tradition as if it's a singular genre, because we know it's not. People like Kevin Schwartz have recently commented on this, right? I don't want to blabber on for too long while not answering the question, but Alex, thank you for this inquiry. I think a good place to start would be Azarang's work that surveys the translations that were done in the late Qajar and early Pahlavi period, and then doing some close textual analysis to see if in fact the prefaces, the way these texts were framed, and the actual translation practices would mirror some of these discursive transformations that I outlined. Thank you for your question.
Yes. So Niall Green now asking, could you perhaps give us a comparative sense of how translation practices in Iran and Afghanistan differed, if at all? I have in mind the choice of texts to translate, the people making the translations, or the techniques of translation per se.
How would they differ? I think that in perhaps intermediary languages would be one very easy difference to highlight. I think in the Afghan case, you have a lot of translations done from Urdu. You have Ottoman Turkish and later Turkish serving as intermediaries. I think that in Iran, that is less, especially with South Asian languages. You have a lot of translations in these periodicals from English, French, also Arabic in both cases. In terms of techniques, I think a really good place to look is Siraj al-Akhbar, the newspaper that the eminent intellectual and perhaps the founder of modern journalism in Afghanistan, Mahmoud Tarzi, ran for about 7, 8 years in Kabul, because one thing I really find interesting is that in the first issue, he basically commissions this very respectable scholar, Abdul Rauf Kandahari, to come, and this is something that Nushin Arbabzadeh has actually written about too in the collection Afghanistan in Ink, to basically define what adabiyat is as this new concept. And it's very interesting because his vision differs significantly from the little prefaces that Tarzi gives you when he's translating this French author and basically serializing his novel in the different issues of Siraj al-Akhbar. And this is something I've written in my first chapter, and now it escapes my mind exactly how that divergence occurred. But I think really good moments where what are the techniques that they're using to introduce concepts that may be new or perhaps sound familiar, but in reality denote an entirely different notion, would be exactly the translations that are happening in these periodicals. And I'm sorry, now, if I was not able to directly answer your question, but I keep looking, I keep reading Siraj al-Akhbar and other periodicals with the hope of giving a more substantive answer.
Okay, so our next question is from Domenico Ingenito, who asks, how did the reification of translation as a transfer between two separate ontological entities influence the emergence of literary modernism in Iran? Can we look at the process you describe as an epistemological tool for different approaches to the study of modernist aesthetics? One remark, in early Persian treatises on rhetoric, Radiani and Fatvat and so on, Tarjumeh was presented as a rhetorical device relating to the art of reversifying Persian lines into Arabic and vice versa.
No, that's another great question, and I think I see a connective tissue between all the three questions, pointing at this separation between discourse analysis and actual literary production, right? And this is something that I'm in the process of looking at. And I think I don't really have a clear answer. In what ways are they informing aesthetics? Yeah, nothing really comes to my mind, but I think this is something definitely that needs to be looked at. One way you could look at it is through some of these new inventions like iqtirah, or the poetic, a test of poetic talent, where you're provided with a prompt, with a prose or with a poem, and then you're asked to basically compose spontaneously a poem in response to it. And I think that really opens a space for this type of historiography to directly shape literary translation. One, which Domenico has generously read as well, that I'm working on, is a call by the nationalist intellectual Mahmoud Afshar in the journal Ayande, where he basically says that Nadir Shah Afshar does not have a single qasida eulogizing his sack of Delhi. And so he calls on people to compose one in the same style as Fateh Sumanat. And so I think a close reading of that would show you that, again, historiography, literary production should not be seen as two bounded categories. In fact, they bleed into one another in ways that are seldom straightforward or predictable.
Yeah, and I would only add that, I mean, thinking again of our colleague, Professor Jabari's work, one way to access in the modernist context that question of the relationship between languages would be to set translation discourse alongside ways that people talk about different sub-languages, code switching, I mean, if we think about like Jamal Zadeh's parodies of Europeanized Persian and Arabized Persian, how is that kind of moving back and forth different from translation between languages, right? Would be maybe 100%. One approach.
And I think in fact, this again shows us that it's not just translation that needs to be taken into question as a category. Persian itself is not a stable category throughout the 20th century. And we pretend that it is. And I think the loss of that, the consequence of that, is that our analysis suffers.
Yeah, it's not just Turkish, that's a catastrophic success. So another question from Prashant Keshavmurthy, who asks, do you think the impediments to translation and validating translation as a form of intellectual creativity include not only the nationalist emphasis on a people's uniqueness, but also the fact that university literary theory has, since around the 1920s, and I would say earlier, mostly drawn from Euro-American universities rather than Asian and African ones? Professor Hossein Payande of the University of Tehran has, for example, lately remarked that almost every major Western work of literary theory now exists in Persian translation, but he does not remark on why the inverse is not true.
Thank you, Prashant, for that question. I think Professor Payande does not remark on that because it is a taken for granted notion that in Iran, unfortunately, the scholarly consensus seems to be that Naqd begins in the late 19th century, that there is no such discourse on literary criticism prior to that. Now, I'm not saying that within our modern framework of what literary criticism is, we should be going back in time and trying to qualify texts into that framework. I don't think that probably serves any purpose. But your point is really, really well taken. And to this day, we don't know. Now, I do acknowledge that this iteration of world literature that I try to critique here is really a 1950s one. And I think when departments of literature in Iran and Afghanistan were emerging, this was the most dominant. World literature necessarily meant an assemblage of nations, and today it decidedly has gone against it. In fact, it's become a category that has accommodated to a really impressive extent the voices of its critics, people like Francesca Orsini, even people with whose criticism I do not agree, like Dr. Emily Apter, and many others. And so I think you're 100% right. We need to begin translating and making available the work of African and Asian, theoreticians.
And maybe this category of the major literary critic, the major work of literary criticism, might be a problem to start off with, that generates a particular kind of, I don't know, canon. So at this moment, while people are thinking up whatever other questions they might have, I wonder, Aria John, whether you might tell us a little bit more about the larger book project that this specific piece that you presented today relates to.
Thank you. Yeah, basically for this invited moment of shameless promotion. This draws on various analyses in the book, and the book is envisioned to have 4 chapters. And the first one basically makes the argument that you can't look at the rise of literature as a conceptual category in Iran and Afghanistan as in the framework of borrowing or adopting. These passive syntaxes really need to be done away with. And it shows the creativity, the innovation, and the carefulness with which people like Mahmoud Tarzi, people like Iqbal Ashtiani across the borders engage with the meaning of adab, and they negotiate its differences, and they parse out valences that in order to basically make adabiyat do a certain type of labor that is demanded by ontological nationalism. So that's basically engaging a shared tradition in the first chapter. In the second, it looks at how Iranians and Afghans are co-constituting nationalism, right? Because one unfortunate consequence of modernity is that in the pre-modern period, everybody acknowledges that we're looking at this vast and open, uneven but open geography. In the modern period, somehow the nation state becomes an accepted unit of analysis, and so people just pretend like the Soviet East is sealed off from Iran. Iran is from Afghanistan, and if there is any sort of direction of intellectual production and contact, it's Afghanistan with South Asia or with Ottoman lands and the Republic of Turkey. And I basically showed that Afghans and Iranians were in conversation, and that their conversations were very generative in surprising ways, and they were very consequential for the creation of their image of themselves. And then chapters 3 and 4 deal with very local examples of how national literary historiography is produced. The Kabul Literary Association and the Herat Literary Association, which I don't think anybody has written about. And then in the case of Iran, mostly Danishkade, early 20th century. And in the conclusion, which is really where I think I get very animated, is the latter part of the 20th century, even the 21st century. What happens to Iranian and Afghan relations? Why is it that, for instance, an Afghan member of parliament takes the mic and passionately basically speaks of how Persian is under attack in Afghanistan by Pashto, and how in Iran there are such unfortunate and wrong views of the Persian variation of Afghanistan. And so what is the new cultural climate under which these two nations are interacting, and how does the past come into the picture, right? How do they remember this past of Iranian scholars going to the University of Kabul as guest lecturers, and Afghans coming to Tehran and doing the same, and students going into both directions to get PhDs in Persian literature. And so that's the book in a nutshell.
Well, we all very much look forward to this book, and it will have an enormous effect when it comes. So as of right now, I'm not seeing any open questions. So it only remains for me to express on behalf of everyone here at Yale our deep gratitude to Professor Fani for coming, for sharing his ideas with us, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much for having me, and I hope to one day have pizza with you in New Haven.